Picture a jail cell with no windows. Thick stone walls, half buried in the ground, a narrow iron grate on the door letting in the only air. Now picture that this cell is the one place on Earth, out of an entire city of 30,000 people, where a person could survive what was coming on the morning of May 8th, 1902. And the man locked inside, it wasn't a hero. He wasn't a scientist, or a soldier, or anyone important. He was a prisoner, thrown in there the night before for getting drunk and skipping work. His name was Ludger Silbaris, and by pure accident, the punishment meant to humiliate him turned into the only thing that saved his life. Everyone else in Saint-Pierre, Martinique had about 2 minutes, then they were gone. This is one of those stories where almost every detail sounds invented, but it isn't. There's a court record confirming the prisoner really was locked up that night. There are doctors' reports on his burns. There's a geologist who inspected the cell itself and concluded that yes, physically, this is exactly the kind of structure that could have kept someone alive through what hit the city. So stick with me, because by the end you'll understand not just how this happened, but why the people who could have escaped didn't. And why the one person who was forced to stay behind a locked door turned out to be the lucky one. Let's start with the city itself, because Saint-Pierre wasn't some sleepy fishing town. It was the beating heart of the French Caribbean. People called it the Paris of the Antilles, and they weren't exaggerating for tourism's sake. This was a genuinely wealthy, genuinely glamorous place. Stone houses with red tile roofs climbed up the hillside in tidy rows. There was a working streetcar line, electric lighting, a theatre that could seat 800 people, a botanical garden, a proper high school. Ships loaded with sugar, coffee, cacao and rum left its harbour constantly, and the warehouses along the waterfront were stacked with thousands of barrels of rum waiting to be shipped out. Even though the official capital of the island was Fort-de-France, 20-some kilometres to the south, the real money, the newspapers and the political power all lived in Saint-Pierre. Which matters, because there was an election coming, and every vote in this city counted. Above all of it loomed a mountain. Montagne Pelée, roughly 1,300 meters tall, sitting about 6 or 7 kilometers north of the city's edge. The indigenous Caribs who'd lived there before the French had a blunt name for it, the Fire Mountain. But by 1902, nobody in Saint-Pierre thought of it that way anymore. French records showed 2 eruptions in the past, one in the late 1600s and one in 1851, both weak, both just steam and ash, neither one hurting a soul. Over 50 years, that turned into a kind of folk wisdom passed around the city. The mountain smokes sometimes, it rumbles sometimes, and that's the end of it. Nothing more ever happens. That belief was about to get tested, and it was about to fail catastrophically. The warning signs had actually been building for months. In January, the fumaroles near the summit, those vents where hot gas escapes through cracks in the rock, started getting more active, and the crater known as the Dry Pond began to smell strongly of sulfur. By late April, there were small explosions and earth tremors. On April 27th, a group of curious locals hiked up for a look and found something strange. The crater that used to be dry now held a lake nearly 200 meters across, pouring boiling water into it. Then, on the night of May 2nd, the mountain got loud. A series of powerful explosions sent a dense black column into the sky. The ground shook. Ash and fine pumice rained down across the whole northern half of the island. A local newspaper postponed a planned picnic on the volcano slopes. That same newspaper would print its very last issue 5 days later. On May 3rd, ash started falling directly on Saint-Pierre itself for the first time. Livestock began dying because their food and water were buried under it. By the 4th, the ash was so thick that coastal boats stopped running, and the northern villages lost contact with the city entirely. Everything was coated in a fine white powder, like the whole landscape had been dusted with flour, and the ash brought something down with it that the people of Saint-Pierre would remember more vividly than almost anything else. Every creature living on the upper slopes started fleeing downhill. Hundreds of fer-de-lance snakes poured into the villages and the outskirts of the city. Behind them came red ants and centipedes up to 30 centimeters long. Horses and pigs screamed as insects crawled up their legs. Soldiers were shooting snakes in the streets. Birds dropped dead out of the sky, coated in ash. Dead fish floated in the bay. By the time it was over, the bites had killed roughly 200 head of livestock and about 50 people, most of them children. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the road between Saint-Pierre and Fort-de-France. Two streams of people were moving in opposite directions along that same road. From the south, residents of Saint-Pierre were trying to leave the city, and soldiers, stationed there on the governor's orders, were turning them back. Some people were flatly refused permission to leave at all. From the north, meanwhile, families were streaming in, fleeing the volcano's slopes because there was nothing left up there to eat or drink. So one line of people was being pushed toward the danger, while the other was being blocked from escaping it. On May 5th, around 1 in the afternoon, the sea suddenly pulled back about 100 meters from the shoreline, and then surged back in, flooding the low streets. At almost the same moment, part of the crater wall collapsed. Boiling water mixed with mud and loose debris and roared down the Rivière Blanche as what's called a lahar, a volcanic mudflow, moving at roughly 100 kilometers an hour. It buried a sugar mill and rum distillery near the river's mouth. When the flow reached the sea, it threw up waves nearly 3 meters high. People watched a factory that had been running all morning simply cease to exist within minutes. That same night, the electrical grid failed and the city went dark. And it was only a few hours after that disaster at the mill that the governor, Louis Moutet, received a document that would seal the fate of 28,000 people. It was a safety report, and it had been written by people with absolutely no business writing it. Here's the problem. Volcanology did not exist as a science in 1902. Nobody on Earth had a scientific vocabulary for what was building inside Montagne Pelée. So when Moutet appointed a commission on May 3rd, the only person on it with any scientific training at all was Gaston Landes, a natural sciences teacher at the local high school. Not a volcanologist, a school teacher with no instruments, no precedent. The commission climbed the mountain, looked at the crater, and delivered its verdict. Nothing in the volcano's behavior justified abandoning Saint-Pierre. The newspaper ran Landes' conclusion in a line that would later travel around the world. They missed one thing, and it was fatal. The rim around the crater had a wide notch in it, shaped like a wedge, opening toward the southwest. And that wedge sat outside the valleys the commission was counting on. It functioned exactly like a gun sight, aimed directly at Saint-Pierre. Gaston Landes died on May 8th, in the city whose safety he had personally certified. But the science was only half the story. Moutet had his own calendar to worry about. A runoff election for a seat in the Chamber of Deputies was scheduled for May 11th, and Moutet's party needed the votes sitting in Saint-Pierre. His opponent was Fernand Clerc, a wealthy planter and Republican candidate. So Moutet did two things that every later investigation into the disaster would zero in on. He asked the newspaper to keep its coverage calm, and he posted soldiers on the road to Fort-de-France to stop anyone trying to get out. Those reassuring newspaper articles were being read out in the villages. They genuinely believed it was the safest place on the northern half of the island. On the night of May 6th, around 2 in the morning, a rumble came from deep inside the volcano, and by morning part of the emissions had started to glow. Nobody at the time understood what that meant, but we understand it now. It marked the moment fresh magma reached the surface, instead of just old material and steam. That same day brought news from a neighbouring island to the south, Saint Vincent, where the volcano La Soufrière had just erupted, killing around 16 people. In Saint-Pierre, people took this as good news. The theory going around was that the two volcanoes were connected underground. So if pressure had released through Saint Vincent, Montagne Pelee had effectively been let off the hook. It comforted a lot of people on what turned out to be their final day. Not everyone bought it. The captain of an Italian ship, the Orsolina, gave the order on May 7th to cut the mooring lines and leave, abandoning half his cargo of sugar still sitting on the dock. Port officials threatened to have him arrested for sailing without proper clearance. According to several accounts, his answer was something like, he didn't know anything about Montagne Pelee, but if Vesuvius looked the way that volcano looked that morning, he'd be getting out of Naples too. The Orsolina made it to St. Lucia and survived. That same night, Fernand Clerc, the candidate, was standing at home in front of his barometer. His family later said the needle was swinging so violently that he took the instrument off the wall, and in doing so broke it. He couldn't explain exactly what it meant, and he didn't try to. He woke his whole household, loaded his wife and 4 children into a carriage, and left the city that night for his inland estate. By morning, he turned out to be the only person in this entire story who had the money, the standing, access to the exact same information as the governor, and the willingness to act on a gut feeling he couldn't fully justify. Moutet himself stayed. He'd arrived in Saint-Pierre on the 7th with his wife, planning to hike closer to the volcano the next morning to see it for himself. And in the opposite corner of the city, that same evening, guards walked a man named Ludger Silbaris into a solitary cell. We actually know a fair amount about him, because after the disaster both the court and the press dug into his background. Born in 1874 near the fishing village of Le Prêcheur, one of those same villages people were fleeing from, he'd worked as a sailor and a labourer, and he had a history of run-ins with the police. On May 2nd, he'd been arrested for badly wounding an acquaintance with a machete during a drunken argument over money. The version of the story that later spread worldwide claims he was awaiting execution. The jail's own records say something much less dramatic. His sentence was almost finished. On May 7th, he left work without permission, spent the night at a party in the city, and came back on his own the next morning, which earned him 8 days in solitary. That cell was set apart from the regular ones, stone, half sunk into the ground, no windows, air coming in through a narrow grate in the door, and the door itself faced away from the volcano. At 7:52 on the morning of May 8th, the night shift telegraph operator in Saint-Pierre finished sending Fort-de-France the routine update on the volcano's condition. Nothing new to report. The last thing that went out over the wire was the standard sign-off operators used to hand the line to their relief. A moment later, the line went dead. In that same minute, the upper slope of the mountain tore open. A dense black cloud shot out sideways, low to the ground, while a second column rose straight up and mushroomed out, darkening the sky for 80 kilometers around. The horizontal cloud hugged the terrain and came down the mountainside at around 160 kilometers an hour, faster than a hurricane, black and heavy on the outside, glowing on the inside. It was superheated steam, volcanic gas, and searingly fine incandescent dust, all of it well above 1,000 degrees. And that wedge-shaped notch the Safety Commission never mentioned aimed the whole thing directly at Saint-Pierre. The city was completely covered in under 2 minutes. One of the most detailed accounts of what happened inside those 2 minutes, pieced together later from survivor testimony and physical evidence, describes people hearing a roar that grew louder and louder until it was deafening, and then the roof simply tore off. Walls came down. The heat killed people before their clothing even had time to catch fire. Those who tried to run inhaled superheated dust and ash. The dead were found with burned throats and lungs, tongues swollen to twice their normal size, blood in their mouths. Then a layer of ash settled over everything. Stone walls a meter thick were reduced to rubble. Steel beams twisted. A 3-ton statue got torn from its base and thrown 16 meters. The heat ignited everything flammable, and thousands of rum barrels along the waterfront started exploding. Burning rum poured through the streets in rivers, straight down into the harbour. About 20 ships were anchored in the harbour that morning. The largest, the Roraima, had arrived from New York at dawn that same day. Crew members later described everyone on deck watching the volcano nervously, smoke pouring from the crater, the summit invisible. A nanny travelling with an American family overheard the captain telling her employer he had no intention of staying there any longer than necessary. He never got the chance to leave. The closest ship to shore, a cable repair vessel called the Grappler, was working on undersea telegraph lines damaged by the volcanic activity. A witness aboard the Roraima described the wave of fire hitting it broadside like a lightning flash, capsizing it instantly. It burned end to end and sank with its entire crew. The Roraima's own captain was seen gripping the railing, facing the cloud, and then he was gone, thrown overboard, unconscious. In the same instant the ship was hit. Below deck, the nanny had just shut her cabin door when the explosion nearly burst everyone's eardrums. The ship was lifted and slammed back down. She and one 9-year-old girl survived behind that closed door. 28 crew members died, along with nearly every other passenger aboard. Behind the burning cloud came a wave powerful enough to slam the remaining ships against the harbour floor repeatedly. The captain of another vessel, the Roddam, was below decks meeting with an agent when a roar hit that he said shook both the sea and the land. He watched a wall of fire approaching and barely made it to the chart house as burning dust tore through the ship's stem to stern, igniting everything it touched. Somehow, with a badly burned crew and dead scattered across the deck, the Roddam made it out of the harbour under its own power and reached St. Lucia, the only large ship in the anchorage to escape. Nearly every other vessel sank or burned. Of 8 crew aboard a smaller ship called the Diamant, 1 survived, a young crewman thrown overboard on impact, who clung to wreckage for 7 hours, ducking underwater repeatedly to escape the heat. Aboard an Italian ship, falling masts killed the captain. The engineer, buried under his crewmates' bodies, survived, later pulling a lifeboat from the wreckage and rescuing several people, including his own wife. Inside the city itself, only one person left a detailed first-hand account of those 2 minutes. A shoemaker named Léon Compère Leandre, whose home sat right at the outer edge of where the cloud reached. He described a sudden violent wind, the ground shaking, the sky going dark almost instantly. He turned to go inside and felt his arms, legs, and whole body burning as he climbed the few steps to his room before collapsing onto a table. Moments later, 4 people ran in, crying out in pain, though there wasn't a mark of fire anywhere on their clothes. Within 10 minutes, a young girl among them was dead. The others fled. He found the girl's father in another room, dressed, sitting on a bed, dead, purplish, swollen, but his clothes completely untouched by fire. Convinced he was about to die too, he lay down and waited. He came to roughly an hour later to find the roof burning above him, and with his legs bleeding and burned, ran 6 kilometers to the next town to find help. A handful of others survived near that same edge of destruction, most unnamed in the historical record. Some died of their burns in the days that followed. A few made it to a village to the south that had been shielded by a rise in the coastline and were pulled from the beach there. When a French warship reached the city around midday and finally managed to send boats ashore, the heat kept them off until 3 in the afternoon. The captain found the city's main square without a single tree left standing. Burned, uprooted trunks lay scattered across ground littered with bodies. Beyond that, fire and fumes made it impossible to go any further into the ruins. The zone of total destruction covered roughly 21 square kilometers, and inside it, nothing survived, not one living thing. Beyond that ring, buildings stood but people had died. Beyond that, vegetation burned but people lived. For the first hours, nobody in Fort-de-France even knew who was in charge of the island, because the governor was unreachable and his fate unknown. Moutet and his wife had died in the city. So had the American consul and his wife. So had a prominent local lawyer and newspaper founder. The city's newspaper had printed its final issue the day before. The city burned for days. There was no way to bury that many bodies, so sanitation crews simply cremated them where they lay as they worked through the ruins. Thousands more stayed buried under ash that hardened into a crust after the rains, not recovered for weeks. Very few of the dead were ever identified. President Theodore Roosevelt asked Congress for emergency relief funds within days. 6 days later, on May 11th, the very day the election had been scheduled for, 3 residents of a nearby town were picking through the ruins of the jail when they heard a voice calling from beneath the rubble. They tore away the stonework, and there was Lodger Silbaris, alive, on his 4th day trapped inside. By his own account, he'd been waiting for breakfast that morning when the world went dark. Superheated air and fine ash blew in through the door's grate. He urinated on his clothing and used it to try to block the opening. The heat lasted only moments, but long enough to leave him with deep burns across his hands, legs, and back. Yet his clothes never caught fire, and the scorching air never reached his lungs. For 4 days he survived on rainwater seeping in through the grate. Rescuers got him to a hospital. While he was still recovering, on May 20th, a second eruption, identical in force, hit what remained of Saint-Pierre and killed roughly 2,000 more people, most of them rescue workers, engineers and sailors who'd come to bring in supplies. Silbaris told his story to French and American reporters, and at first almost nobody believed him. A man who survived 4 days buried in ash, in a city where literally no one else survived at all. It sounded like exactly the kind of tall tale newspapers were inventing left and right that month, and there were plenty of fabricated ones to compare it to. But Silbaris' story held up under scrutiny in a way the others didn't. The appeals court in Fort-de-France pulled his file and confirmed he really had been imprisoned the night before the eruption. A geologist who came to study the volcano personally inspected the construction of the cell and concluded that yes, physically, surviving in there was plausible. Fernand Clerc, the same man who'd fled with his family after his barometer shattered, vouched that Silbaris had genuinely lived in Saint-Pierre for years and was a known face around the city. Doctors who treated him documented his burns. He was eventually pardoned and released from his cell, but by then there was nothing left for him to return to. The city that had known him, the people who could vouch for his life before that morning, all of it was gone. He surfaced in New York in early 1903, giving interviews, showing his scars to reporters. The Barnum and Bailey Circus signed him up, put him on tour beside a full-scale replica of his cell, and billed him as the man who lived through Doomsday. In a show where acts were segregated by race, he was its first black headline attraction. It lasted only a few months before he was let go after drunken fights with other performers. He was arrested more than once in New York for assault, the same kind of trouble that had landed him in that cell in the first place, and was eventually deported. He made his way to Panama, worked on the canal, and died there in 1929, broke and largely forgotten. He was 55. Back in Martinique, people had no idea what had actually become of him for decades. A different legend took hold instead, that he'd become a millionaire, lived to 80, died in Paris in the 1950s, even written a memoir. No such book exists in any catalogue anywhere, and to this day, the plaque beside his old cell, still standing among the ruins, in a city that eventually rebuilt itself at a fraction of its former size, gives his name as the press garbled it back in 1902, not the name recorded in his actual birth record from 1874. 28,000 people were held in Saint-Pierre against their will that week, by soldiers on the road out, by newspaper articles telling them it was safe, by a schoolteacher's official report. Every one of them died. One man was held against his will too, behind a stone door, underground, in a windowless cell, and he was the one who walked out alive. That cell wasn't just any room either. It had been built as the jail's powder magazine, designed specifically to contain an explosion from the inside. In a city with a cathedral, a theatre, army barracks and grand houses, the only structure engineered to survive a blast of that magnitude turned out to be the punishment cell, and the man who ended up there was the one being punished hardest of all. That cell still stands today, in the ruins of the old prison, the same iron grate still in the door. Everything else, the theatre, the cathedral, the streetcar line, never came back. The Paris of the Antilles exists now only in photographs taken in the first days of May 1902. Of everything that once stood in Saint-Pierre, the thing people travel to see today is a jail cell. And here's a strange footnote worth sitting with. 300 years earlier, 5 villages in Peru were buried overnight by a volcanic eruption, and the following year turned into the coldest year the Northern Hemisphere had seen in 6 centuries. Whether a single eruption on the other side of the planet can trigger famine 10,000 kilometers away is a question worth its own video. So if that's the kind of thing you want to see next, you know what to do. Thanks for watching.